Floods are destructive, and the future looks bleak with predictions of more frequent and more intense floods as a consequence of climate change. Indeed, IPCC's latest assessment identifies the poor and in urban areas as particularly vulnerable. In an effort to reduce impact and manage risk, we have organizations like ADPC, and in this context, let me elaborate a little bit on the Mekong River Commission with respect to floods and drought management in the Mekong River Delta. As you may all know, Mekong River is the longest river in Southeast Asia, running through 6 countries. Starting at 5,000 meters in the Chinese part of Himalayas, the Mekong winds through Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia before reaching the sea in southern Vietnam. Floods and droughts are present risks in any large river system. Not all floods are bad, and indeed the Mekong River Basin, the regular floods are essential in providing the bountiful productivity in agriculture and fisheries. Where rice crop is still often dependent on flood waters, and the fisheries is unrivaled, in the inland fisheries is unrivaled in the world. And the flood pulse system actually sustains the high biological productivity. The Mekong is, for a large river, a very regular and predictable. The floods come every year, and this hydrograph, which shows month on the bottom and the water volume here at Kratche throughout the year. It comes every year and is followed by a low flow dry season. About 80% of the annual flow happens in 6 months. And the flow are highly variable throughout the year, but as this hydrograph shows, and in the next area, it is actually very, very predictable. So it's variable but predictable. And here you can see the onset, the stations along the river on the left. The interesting one is the third column, the standard deviation on the onset of the floods. In other words, every year, around June, it starts flooding in Shenzhen, and it's plus minus 2 weeks. So it's either a week earlier or a week late, more or less. So it's very regular, but there is a big difference between the wet season and the dry season. But the extent of the floods can be and are destructive. The Mekong River Commission, or MRC, is charged with supporting the cooperation between its member countries, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand and Vietnam, in the management and development of water and related resources. And the flood management program, with respect to disaster risk reductions, we are basically involved in flood management and drought management. And MRC, which for floods, MRC have been involved in this for over a decade. Flood management, flood risk assessment, flood warning, flood awareness, and recently additional flash flood warning, which perhaps is less relevant in this context of the Delta. The Flood Management and Mitigation Program, or FMMP, was developed following the devastating floods back in 2000. The MRC Secretariat works with the governments of Vietnam and Cambodia, and among other things, we are preparing flood risk maps for vulnerable areas in the Mekong, including the Delta, both at large scales, which is shown here, and at local scales. And this, together with national efforts, have during the last decade improved the understanding and awareness of flood-prone areas, allowing the national governments to ensure improved ability to mitigate flood damage. Maximum flood extent has also been provided based on historical data to provide a concept of what the extent of flooding that can be expected. This will be enhanced with the work on climate change effects of floods, which will have shaping the future of the work in flood management, and is very important to MRC. This was touched upon before. We can't rely on past records to anticipate the future in the context of climate change and looking into how maximum flood extent may be changing in the future. Flood forecasts. The MRC's Regional Flood Center provides twice daily forecasts for up to 5 days. If you see the diagram on the right, this is for Tan Chau in the Delta, taken from our website yesterday. And normally we do it from June to October. This year we have extended it into November as well. And this is done for a number of stations, 23 stations along the mainstream of the Mekong. In the top part you will see the profile of the river in that area, the past 5 days and the next coming 5 days, and at the bottom some hydrographs which tracks particular wet years, particular dry years, and the current year, so we can see how it compares. And this is available on our website. Data from 138 hydrometeorological stations are used to predict water level at 23 forecast points on the river system. And these forecasts are transmitted to the responsible authorities and agencies and organizations in the member countries, as well as published on the MRC website. And these forecasts are based on MRC's hydrometeorological networks, with stations all the way from China to the Delta. And these regional forecasts support the national forecast and provides, especially in the Delta, with additional lead time for flood events outside the norm. And I appreciate the point taken up that we are still working on, and we need to cooperate with other agencies in ensuring that the data gets out to where it's helpful at the local level. But do we have any impact? Do we have any success? Does this work? Although not attributably totally to MRC's effort, but also very much to national governments, there are strong evidence for success in many, if not all, areas. This is a map where the pink color is the extent of the flood in 2000, and the red color is the extent of the 2001 flood, 2011 flood. And they were very similar in area of extent. If we look at another measure, and this measure is the flood volume, where the annual flood peak is graphed on the left, and at the bottom the annual flood volume, we'll find that the 2000 flood, which is there, and the 2011 flood are very similar, and they are outside 2 standard deviations of the long-term mean. It means that in 95% of cases, according to statistics, this doesn't occur. They are extreme events, and they are very similar. But as had been pointed out already, the 2011 flood was not as devastating as in 2000. The damage in terms of loss of lives and economic loss was significantly less. And we had reports from what the impact was in Vietnam, for example, where the numbers of deaths were much reduced. And the reduction in damage can be attributed to improved awareness and preparedness in the Delta and in the floodplains of Cambodia. And we will continue work with the Cambodian and Vietnamese governments to try to establish how work on flood management contribute to the reduced impact, to be able to learn from the lessons and see where we got good impact for the efforts that were made. MRC does not specifically target flood management in cities, but with respect to how floods may affect townships and cities in the Delta, the MRC does provide support through information, awareness, other capacity building and tools for flood risk management. The MRC is also involved in drought and low flow predictions, and the drought management program has just started up and is focusing on preparing drought risk maps and drought hotspots. This year, we began providing the member countries with predictions of dry season water levels in the mainstream. And the intention in the end is that in the end of the wet season every year, to provide information about the mainstream flows for the coming 4 or 5 months, to provide time to put management measures in place. In 2013, earlier this year, the hydrological drought affected the Delta, and if MRC's low flow prediction had been ready in time, because this was the first time we were providing it, and we instead had provided it in late 2012 instead of 2013, it could have helped in management of the drought in the Delta. And we do plan to make predictions at the end of this month, end of November every year, for the next 4 or 5 months. But a key feature of MRC's work is transboundary cooperation. And for this, several tools have been developed. Perhaps the most well-known are the MRC procedures, and particularly the sharing of information and data, which we call the procedures of data exchange and information sharing. And the Regional Flood Center does work under an agreement on what it should provide in terms of forecasts for, and currently this is not covering tributaries, but it is, we're actively working on it and are working with the countries to extend into the tributaries as well. We're also focusing on transboundary cooperation, and they currently have a transboundary cooperation initiative between Cambodia and Vietnam in the Delta on flood management, and that is being initiated this year. But what we're very good at, meetings. feature of regional cooperation and transboundary action is trust, and this is where meetings fit in. And I would like to share Professor Crasset's reference to the importance of trust and cooperation that he made this morning. We meet a lot, maybe too often, but it does provide continuity and trust in terms of work. And within the defined framework and long-going programs addressing floods, this provides the member countries with the trust. And MRC can often act as a conduit for bilateral cooperation in these areas. And let me give you a small example, although it's not in the Delta, but it's an example of transboundary cooperation between Thailand and Cambodia. After the flash floods in 2012, which was in eastern Cambodia and in the boundary areas from Thailand, water flowing from Thailand into Cambodia, MRC was contacted and has facilitated the two countries to investigate the causes, look into what can be done, and have improved the mechanism for information sharing, which is continuing facilitated by MRC. And we have achieved to do this 100 kilometers or so southeast of the disputed area of Previhan. The Mekong River Commission is able to facilitate this cross-border cooperation because we are a well-known framework, trust and reliability, and we allow the partners to focus on the technical aspects without fearing that border demarcation issues needs to be considered in this context. I would be happy to further elaborate on the experiences and the difficulties in transboundary cooperation, access to data, trust in data, protocol versus expediency, but I believe the time is a bit short for this presentation. But in summary, the MRC is providing its member countries with a functioning framework, several services and environmental trust to enable them to cooperate in transboundary aspects of flood management in an increasingly effective way. The MRC's motto with respect to flood management is living with floods, putting awareness, warning, preparedness, and other non-structural measures in the forefront.